Welcome to the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm your host, Shahram Azhar, Associate Professor of Economics at Bucknell University, and I'm joined by Professor Richard Wolff. Hey guys, this is Shahram welcoming you to another brand new season of the Dialectic at Work, a podcast dedicated to understanding the interdisciplinary world of Marxian theory, its philosophy, its politics, and its economics. I'm extremely grateful as we embark upon season 2 of the Dialectic at Work. I want to thank you all for your continued support and your love and your comments on our YouTube pages. The year, as you guys may have already noticed, did not begin well for global capitalism. The second largest economy in Europe, Germany, literally just announced that it's going to revise its growth estimates downwards to 0.3%. And on January 27th, $600 billion were erased in valuations from AI tech companies in the US. Well, some of you may be wondering why capitalism is prone to such volatility, to booms and busts. Because literally from its inception, the system has been prone to one speculative bubble after another. The tulip mania, the dot-com bubble, the South Sea bubble, the Mississippi bubble. You get the picture. So this week, the dialectic goes to explore the following question. Why is capitalism prone to such movements and crises? What is it specifically in the logic of the economic system that produces such madness, these stock valuation booms and busts? And how does Marxian theory help us understand this particular phenomenon? With me, as always, is a man who has spent an entire lifetime rethinking about Marxian theory and the art of teaching it. Professor Richard Wolff. How are you, Professor?
Very good, Shara. I'm glad to be here.
Professor, I dive straight into the questions and specifically want to start with something that you said in a tweet a couple of days ago. You tweeted about this AI tech collapse recently and said something very interesting on your Twitter page. You said, and I quote, that high-tech stocks that zoom upward can easily drop down just as fast. And two, China made that happen as its remarkable dynamism increasingly will do. I was wondering if you could say something more about that.
Yes, let me do so. Capitalism is a system set up with typically multiple enterprises dumping their outputs into a market for whatever that output is. So different companies making a software program or different companies making an ice cream cone, it really doesn't matter. That's the typical way that this works. Sometimes it's large numbers of what we call competing enterprises. Sometimes it's a small number. We call that an oligopoly, and sometimes one emerges as the only one, and that's a monopoly. The interesting question is, what does competition among them mean? Well, let me make it very simple and very direct. It means that at any moment, any producer who's busily a capitalist, employed workers, bought machines, produces the output, charges for it an amount of money that he hopes will allow him to replace the tools and equipment used up, to pay the workers whatever he has contracted to pay them, and to leave him with a residue, a profit, if you like, that rewards him for undertaking the whole business. But there's a problem. There are competitors. There are others. And since they all produce, by definition, they're in an industry has a product, whatever it is, they're all producing. And there's therefore a temptation always to do the following. And this temptation confronts all of them. If I lower my price, for whatever reason, if I lower my price, the customers are going to leave my competitors and buy whatever the object is from me because they get the same object, more or less, at less money, which is in their interest to do. Every capitalist knows this, knows that they can lower the price either if they're willing to do without some of their profit for a while. They lowered the price. They still have to pay to replace their inputs. They still have to pay their workers, but they'll take a cut from their own share, their profits, if the reward is to destroy their competitors. Why? Because if they don't have any more competitors, if they've all gone out of business because all the business came to him when he cut his price, well, then will have become a monopolist. And what the monopolist can do is raise the prices way above what they were before because the customers have no options. And therefore, if they want that product, they'll have to pay him whatever the market will bear. And so you can get terrible trouble for a company out of the very logic of the competitive capitalist system. And notice here, the companies that go out of business aren't doing anything different from what they did last year, the year before, the year before. In other words, the businesses reproducing themselves do so hoping, if they're knowledgeable, that this that I just described won't happen to them. But they are aware that it could. What's typically also the case is they're aware that they might like to be in the position of the one who plays the game, destroys the competitors, and then can recoup his profit plus however much the market will bear. All right, now let's take it into technology. Developing your technology, that is, improving how you go about transforming inputs into outputs, is always changing. There are always people, your competitors included, that are looking for ways to become more what we call efficient. That is, get the same output for fewer or different inputs. And that would allow you, because you've made a saving by installing the new technology, you can destroy your competitors just in the way you would have been able to do if you'd be willing to take a lower profit. But in this case, you're not required to take a lower profit. All you need to do is to discover and buy and install a new technology. That's how we went from, producing cloth by having people work with their hands to doing it with a loom, to doing it with a power source that moves the parts of the loom. And so we have modern textiles and modern clothing that can now be produced at a small fraction. The companies that led the way doing that destroyed their competitors. You can't even find historical records of many of these businesses because they were competed out of existence. But here's the problem. This whole situation creates a constant existential threat to every capitalist. And that threat is somebody somewhere will figure out a better technology and will withhold it from you, not tell you about it, not allow you to use it, which then becomes your death as an enterprise. You disappear. What happened earlier this week was that a very small company in China, DeepSeek, by name DeepSeek, announced that it had developed a new kind of AI. You can lay off some of your workers. You won't have to pay them wages. And that allows you to lower the price of whatever you make. If you can save thousands of wages by buying for $1,000 this new chip, although I should mention that DeepSeek makes its material available for free on the internet, which suggests that socialism in China seems to mean something. Because no capitalist firm would do that, because there's a lot of money if you are the new technology, because all the capitalists will come to your door to get it. And by the way, the largest single AI related item downloaded by Apple users over the last 5 days has been this Deep Select product, not the competing products coming out of Apple or any of the others that are busy doing this sort of thing. So it's a classic case in which an entrepreneur, by the name, I made a note of it, Liang Wenfeng in China, an entrepreneur a year and a half ago, in May of 2023, sets up this company and hires a bunch of new graduates from China's burgeoning population of technical universities and technical colleges. There's a lot of people with a lot of skill around in that society now. That's a decision of the socialist government to stimulate and support all of that. I should note for people, if you want the most important element that I can think of as to why this happened in China and not here, I would say to you, in China, there's a new university opening every few months. In the United States, there's a university closing every few days. And that is a difference that in the longer run is going to produce many more experiences like the one I'm describing with Deep Seeks. In short, they are now sitting on top of what's going to be a tremendous boom, because not only is it high quality, and not only is it available for next to nothing or nothing, but it is going to be reproduced, since it costs a tiny fraction to produce relative to what these kinds of chips were being sold for by the big companies, mostly in the United States, that are alternatives. That's why you will see, if you haven't already, a propaganda blizzard accusing this little company of copying, of taking its technology from the others. I'm not a technical expert. I would assume they probably did, because almost all technology uses what went before to try to do it better. Yelling at someone for doing that is a little silly. It counts on the audience not knowing that copying, either paying for what you copy, stealing what you copy, is normal, happens all the time, happens crisscross the world. The sudden announcement that you're outraged that this has happened means that you're either ignorant in a way where my heart goes out to you, or you're just a liar, hoping that people don't understand that the accusation you're making is childish. Britain accused the United States of stealing everything from British economy, and there was a lot of truth to it. The Germans stole from the British. Central Europeans, Polish people stole from the German. I mean, stealing is very close to using. When you use a technology, you learn about it, and if you're clever, you can begin to see ways to improve it. So, yes, Deep Select, no doubt, studied existing technology and took it one step further, which is normal. But that normal takes me back to telling you why capitalism is a terribly anxiety provoking system. There's a reason capitalists die of heart attacks early in life, because they are living an impossible situation at any moment. That's why Sharon was good to tell you. On Monday of this last week, NVIDIA, which was the leading company producing these kinds of chips, lost, if I understand it, hundreds of billions of dollars of value in a matter of minutes. You try to understand. That's an amount of money that equals what the the gross domestic product of many countries is. So
Single largest drop in the US stock market history. Single largest drop.
Okay, there we go. So that gives you NVIDIA was a dream company. It went
Yeah.
from nothing to being valued at more than $2 or $3 trillion. It's mind bending. And then this little company in a little corner of China with a little entrepreneur is able to cause. It gives you an idea. That's the worst nightmare every capitalist suffers. And by the way, it's one of the explanations that should be understood. Why are capitalists always trying to press down the wages they pay? Like using immigrants, if they can do it that way, moving production to where the poorer worker lives so you could hire them, replacing workers with machines. What is it? And you'll hear people who don't understand capitalism tell you, oh, they're greedy. This has nothing remotely to do with greed. Are capitalists greedy? Sure. Are workers greedy sometimes? Sure. But this has nothing to do with some personality quirk. This has to do with a system that is ruthless in rewarding the one who makes a breakthrough and punishing the one who doesn't. And therefore, they're constantly squeezing. Why? Because the more profit they can get now, the better their cash position to buy a new technology when one emerges. The company that can get their hands on it fastest wins. If you discover a new cheap resource, if lithium turns out to make a better battery for electric cars than other materials, well, then you want to get your hands on. And how do you get lithium? You have to buy it. Where do you buy it from? Well, you hope to find the cheapest, but your competitor may have a lot of money with which to buy the lithium and keep you from it. Oh, you better always accumulate. That's why in volume one, there's that lovely line of Marx's, accumulate, accumulate for the capitalist. That is Moses and the prophets. That's a clever line. The religion of capitalism is not about greed, it's about survival. They can only survive by doing to others what they fear those others will do to them. It is the corruption of the golden rule, but it is the core of capitalism, and it is illustrated very dramatically. Now, of course, there are other dimensions. I don't know if you want to go through them, but why has this happened, and why do the Chinese? And before I tell you the answer, let me assure you all that this latest example, in this case AI, is one of many. The highest quality and lowest price electric vehicles are now made in China. 15, 20 years ago, automobile companies began to compete to discover the best way to make an electric vehicle. They all saw that was the future they were shaping the automobile industry to go to. By the way, as a critic of capitalism, let me be sure you understand the logical improvement over the oil fueled private car is mass transportation. It can move
Yeah.
more people at a lower cost than the absurdity that we each have an automobile sitting in the garage or on the street most of the hours of every day. It would be infinitely better to share that and to have public transportation. We didn't do that. And we didn't do that in the world of capitalism because the capitalist automobile industry is big enough and strong enough in most countries to dominate. So, what we have done is something much less ecologically advantageous, namely an electric private car. Okay, given that irrationality of capitalism, here's the competition. If you produce the electric car or truck or both, think for a minute. The whole world of producers, of enterprises, most of them need either trucks to bring their inputs to the place of business or trucks to take the outputs from the business to wherever they are marketed. Okay, so you have an enormous competitive system that will be competing to get the cheapest, best electric car. So they all put it when Tesla, Elon Musk is a name you know only because he was one of the earliest ones to see and pursue what became commonplace. But Tesla may have been the earliest, and Tesla may have been number one before, but it isn't anymore. Why not? A relatively small Chinese company, one of I think, about 30 electric vehicle producing enterprises in China, did what DeepSeek did. They came up, they studied other people's electric cars for sure. They studied the automobile business, which is already well established in China, has been for decades. And the BYD company, that's the name of the company in China, three initials, B, Y, and D, they produce the best quality electric cars and trucks at the lowest price. They won the competition. Okay, that's why the rest of the automobile industry is pressuring the American government, where automobiles are important, European governments, where automobiles are important, to give them protection because they can't compete. What they
Mm-hmm.
say is the typical bloviating propaganda nonsense that capitalists always say because they cannot stand up and say, I failed at the competition. This is dangerous in their view, ideologically, and they may be right. So they come up with things like the Chinese cheat, or one of these arguments that only works if people are either ignorant or don't want to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Every economy that went from small or poor to large and rich did this. The American companies stole ideas, copied ideas, as I said before, from the Europeans, the Americans from the British, everybody from everybody, and the British before them had stolen from others. This is economic development, is the polite term for this activity. So, yes, the Chinese had no manner of hesitation and they won the competition, which, friends, is what counts. History keeps track of the winner and forgets the loser. That's partly because the winner writes the history. Okay, so here we are. Here we are. What happened? Europe has about a 30% tariff against electric vehicles. The United States currently has a 100% tariff. Let me be sure everybody understands. If an American wants to buy a Chinese electric vehicle, simply because it is the best and the cheapest, and let's assume it's $30,000 to get this car or this truck, you would have to, if you're an American, a company or an individual, if you want to buy that $30,000 vehicle, you would have to come up with $30,000 that go to China to pay for the vehicle to be shipped, and then you'd have to pay 100% tariff. Another 30,000 to Uncle Sam as the tariff. Tariff is just the name of a tax. The tax on that imported vehicle. So it would cost you double. You have to pay $60,000 if you're a company to get your hands on the best, cheapest electric truck. And now the punchline. All of your competitors, if you're an ice cream producer or an underwear producer or a bridge producer, it doesn't matter. You will not be unable to compete because you can't afford a $60,000 truck. But your competitors around the world, they can. They live in countries that don't have a tariff, so they can get that truck for the $30,000 the Chinese producer asks for it, which means they will all outcompete Americans. And now here comes the punchline. The tariff, at best, protects the particular industry and the workers in that industry from competition. But meanwhile, it hurts them in terms of the competition of every other industry with the rest of the world, because the rest of the world will be able to buy the cheap, high quality trucks from China, but the Americans will either have to go without or they'll buy the less good, more expensive electric vehicle made by Tesla or GM or Ford or Toyota or anyone else you might pick. And what are they going to charge for their cars? Well, they know they have protection. They can produce a crappy vehicle, sell it for 40,000, and Americans will buy it because they can't afford the 60,000 and they can't get legally. So what Mr. Trump is doing, and by the way, the 100% tariff is not what Mr. Trump did. That's what Mr. Biden did. Mr. Trump may raise it further, but the irony is, do not associate this particularly with Trump. He bloviates about it a lot, but he doesn't do it that much more than Mr. Biden, who basically copied Mr. Trump in this regard. But when Mr. Trump says, I'm putting on tariffs to protect American workers, this is economic nonsense. He doesn't know whether the loss of jobs from all the American companies that go out of business because they can't buy the cheap input. It's just like being outdone by a new technology. You're outdone by a new kind of vehicle, but you can't afford it. And the only reason is your own government is doing what? Mr. Trump is pandering to the automobile industry. That's all. It's good. They will give him a lot of money to impose a tariff because it's good for them. They don't care what happens to the rest. In the long run, that's very stupid. But capitalists don't have the luxury of calculating long runs. They're doing what they need to do now. So what you're seeing is, I hope, a lesson in the fragility of capitalism, how dependent it is on all of these things over which the capitalist has no control. It's obvious watching the terror in the American high tech industry these last few days. None of them expected a Chinese competitor to do this. It is a bitter lesson for them. And some of them will now be driven out of business. These were billion-dollar corporations. They will be driven out of business unless they can come up with something of their own to try to do to their competitors what the little DeepSeek company just did to them.
Wow. Wow. And this is despite the fact that last year the US government imposed various restrictions on NVIDIA as well as TSMC, the number one chip producer in the world in Taiwan, on selling those chips to Chinese companies. And of course, despite those prohibitions, DeepSeek, which is an algorithmic model, has been outrunning and outperforming OpenAI. And in fact, speaking of this anxiety that you alluded to, that is inbuilt within the logic of capitalist accumulation, you know that the joke these days is that AI was supposed to take a lot of jobs, and Sam Altman's OpenAI seems to be the first one to lose that particular job. So, in this odd dialectical way, if you like, because I want to invite audiences to go back and watch our episode on Hegel, where you said something very interesting, that inbuilt within our reasoning must be the ability to look at the contradictory effects of a particular phenomenon. So, in this odd kind of dialectical way, it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, that technological progress, which is celebrated by bourgeois and mainstream economists, has within it, under capitalist conditions of production, the birth and death of firms, right? And so, in this precise sense, I wanted to kind of ask you my next question, which would be about Marx's crisis theory. Because you're an expert of both the neoclassical, the Keynesian school of economics, the mainstream versions of economics, as well as Marxian theory. So, to the best of my knowledge, in mainstream theory, we don't really have a good theory of why capitalism has these crises. At best, it's an aberration that should not have happened. Markets clear, prices go up and down, the curve goes to a new place all on its own. So, how does, because you've written a book recently called Understanding Capitalism, which devotes a part of it to why capitalism is crisis prone. Could you walk us through the alternative visions in economics, in mainstream versions of economics or in Marxian theory? What's the take on crisis, and how does each theory make sense of crises in capitalism?
Okay, let's begin by a piece of empirical factuality. Capitalist systems, from the earliest time in England, usually thought of in England before it spread to Western Europe and then to the empires and eventually global. Wherever capitalism has arrived and displaced, for example, feudal or slave or other economic systems, it has brought with it crises. In fact, the language in English and in other languages is very rich. Crisis, catastrophe, downturn, recession, depression, collapse. I mean, I could go on. Why? Because it's a recurring phenomena. Because the history of capitalism is the history of people really troubled by this recurring phenomena which they couldn't get under control. One of the things Marx admired, for example, in Ricardo, was he didn't shy away from saying, wait a minute, what's this about? Why do we have this? Every few years, suddenly, people lose their jobs, businesses go belly up. We have social unrest because people are suffering. And by the way, you didn't have to persuade political leaders. They got frightened by this spectacle. Workers made revolutions sometimes when the downturn was too hard, lasted too long, cut too deeply. So it's been a problem all along. Well, the bourgeois world, the capitalist world, their first idea was to banish it, right? To pretend somehow it didn't happen. It was not easy to do, but they did it. But the larger culture didn't allow that kind of denialism, for lack of a better term, to fly. You can see it in the 18th and 19th century, where these periodic collapses had very dramatic names. Here in the United States, the Panic of 1847. What interesting word. It tells you something, the crash, the great crash, the whatever, it became impossible simply to deny it. So they didn't do it simply. They did it in a sophisticated way. If I had a lot of time, and if you wish, we could talk. The very interesting concept, very important in conventional bourgeois economics, the concept of what is so called an equilibrium. Endless examples with as much mathematics as you can cram into them to suggest to you that capitalism is best understood as a system that is so connected one part to another that it will move toward a place from which it has no reason to move any further. And that place is called an equilibrium. And then there are exercises designed to show a student learning this that if you depart from equilibrium, if the price of something in the market isn't the equilibrium price, here's how this system, you're supposed to get very excited about this, will take us back to the equilibrium that is inherent in it. If you show it the curves properly, inherent is an equilibrium. The system will go to it. Indeed, the ideological opportunities with this kind of thinking were wonderful. You could denounce anything that you didn't like as a capitalist on the grounds that it departed from or broke equilibrium. No, we don't want the government to intervene because then we will go to an equilibrium that isn't the one that we ought to, if you're willing to admit there could be more than one. And that was a huge debate in the history of economics, whether there's one or multiplicity of them, and on and on. So the whole idea of equilibrium, Marx used to make fun of it. He said the world is a constant demonstration that nothing that exists lasts. So equilibrium is what you don't have. What kind of a theory starts with what you don't have? Very strange. So Marx, and he wasn't the only one, began to be very interested because he could see that these ups and downs were intrinsic. They resisted all kinds of efforts to overcome them. And they were moments which, when they lasted a long time, which some did, when they cut deeply, which some did, not all, but some did, were themselves provocations for a working class, which was the one that suffered most in these downturns. These downturns could become revolutionary moments of understanding and mobilization that the system is the problem, which is why the bourgeois, those who understood that this was a recurring problem, that they had not found any way to stop it, began, particularly about a century and a half ago, maybe a little longer, to come up with their own theories. No more denying, yes, we have them, but, and the one I like most, which used to be taught to students, was called the sunspot theory. I didn't make this up, friend. I don't have the imagination. But bourgeois thinkers began to do the mathematical game of connecting variables. And you make some independent, interesting move, others dependent, another interesting move, and you show how the dependent depends on the independent, and you learn the techniques for doing that. And so they charted sunspots and economic fluctuation. They saw a correlation, one of the great joys of this kind of thinker. They saw a correlation and announced they had figured out why we have business cycles. It's about the sunspots. They affect the tides of the ocean. That affects our agriculture, and that affects our. They had it. They were so pleased with this crap. Okay, what am I going to say? What? Why would you reach like that? And the answer is, and Marxists have noticed this. It's not me. They had found something other than the capitalist system to blame for the recurring crises that capitalism could not cure. And let me remind you, the two greatest crises, one in the 20th century, so-called Great Crash, 1929 to 1940, and the second worst crash, the one in 2008 and 9, not so long ago. And here's what you know. If the bad ones, two really bad ones, happen in 2008 and 9, and then again in 2020, associated with the virus, well, here we are. They've had 2, 3, maybe 400 years of capitalism to prevent these crises, and they still can't do it. A whole economics, you referred to it, the economics of John Maynard Keynes, and let's give him his due. Here's a bourgeois economist, trained in the bourgeois system of his country, the son of another economist, so he got it at home as well as at school. One of their great economists, everybody agrees, in the depths of the great crash of the 1930s, he writes a book, The General Theory, which begins by saying, I'm part of a generation, we now call them neoclassical economics. We didn't understand how this great crash could happen. We didn't see it coming. We don't know what precipitated it, and we don't know what to do about it either. We are, in short, defunct. And then, because he doesn't want to have just bad news, he says, but there is a solution. If we bring the government in to the economy, if we throw our laissez-faire idea that capitalism works best when the government is minimally powerful, minimally interventionist, we got to get rid. That's wrong. The government has to come in, has to stay in, has to monitor, has to intervene. And I can show you in my book how to do it in broad strokes. And that will enable us perhaps not to end the crisis. Mr. Uh, Keynes was modest in this regard, but at the very least to moderate it. So this then becomes Keynesian economics. It's been in use ever since, all over the place, displaced the neoclassical dominance pretty much starting in the 1940s and then globally. And it's only in the last few years, with the end of the American empire, and therefore the end of the world economy that they reconstructed around a rejection of Keynesian economics. Now it's coming back again because the country is in trouble and it is leaning on government intervention beyond anything it had seen. And that's why the Trump administration is dramatic in our modern culture, because he's intervening all over the place.
Hmm. So, some people on the left, you've already kind of alluded to it, some people on the left tell us that the problem is not capitalism in general, but free market capitalism. And I remember that you used to tell us, your students, this story about how capitalism's crash in 1929, and then in the 1970s. He used to tell this story about FDR and how his rise, how Keynes and Keynesian economics kind of helped capitalism survive at that point in time from an economic standpoint. But as soon as capitalists could reverse the government regulations and the social security and all the rest of it that the workers were receiving, they did that, paving the way for the next crisis, which was your famous documentary called Capitalism Hits the Fan about 16 years ago. Could you help our audiences could you repeat that story for our audiences and tell us a little bit about how that same story can is manifesting itself now in a new and a in a new kind of a way.
Sure, sure. We can pick up the story again in the Great Depression. Here is this professor at Cambridge University, the son of another famous, he's the great British economist, outshining virtually everybody else. And remember, modern economics is more English than it is any other country. I mean, that's where much of its intellectual power emerges. Even Marx earlier recognized that political economy was an acutely English contribution. The French contributed, political activism and politics, the Germans philosophy, and the English economics. The three sources, if you like, of Marxism. And the Great Depression, if you remember what I quoted, Keynes is turning critical of his own upbringing, his own teaching. It produced an interesting coming together. And it's a coming together of those people who were bourgeois economists who loved capitalism deeply. Keynes was one of those, by the way. But it brought them into contact they would not have had otherwise with the pariah, the Marxists. And remember, from 1870 to the Great Depression in the 1930s is the rise and heyday of neoclassical economics, but it is also the rise and heyday of Marxian economics, because just as the neoclassical was adopted by all of the capitalist forces in society, a Marxist alternative was emerging powerful in the socialist parties, in the labor movement, culminating in the Russian Revolution when Marxists take over. So all of this is happening literally at the same time, and it produces, not surprisingly, in the 1930s, a kind of coming together in which the Marxists, overjoyed to see a portion of the bourgeois economists who normally either denounced or ignored them, feeling a kind of solidarity. We all realize that free market capitalism is the problem. And the Marxists felt strengthened by the alliance with the Keynesians and vice versa. You know, even in Cambridge, you could see if you're interested in the relationships among Keynes, Joan Robinson, Maurice Dobb, and people like that, the literal coming together. Maurice Dobb becomes an editor of the collected works of David Ricardo. What the hell's that about? You know, why, what? And so there's and the reason this is important is that it was an alliance based on what I would argue, just me, was a mistake. It was true that Keynes was critical of neoclassical, no question, as were the Marxists. But it was also true that Keynes despised Marxism, communism, social, and said so. He didn't make he didn't hide it, but it didn't matter. They they came together in the minds of many Marxists, kind of adopted Keynes's ideas and tried in various ways to blend them with Marxism. I don't think that worked. And again, I would go back and I would say, to make a complex story blunt, Keynes was interested in saving capitalism, saving it from itself, saving that system, the employer-employee system, from its own destructive components. And the government could and would and should be brought in to do that by manipulating the monetary system on the one hand and manipulating government spending and taxes, so-called fiscal issues, on the other. And he provided a system for that. It was picked up by both English and American economists who, in the 1930s, after the book, Keynes's book comes out, really developed that. So when I went to the university in the United States in the 1960s, the Keynesians had taken over. We didn't get they made fun of Milton Friedman as though he were an ancient dinosaur who had somehow survived. They didn't take any of that seriously. The notion that the best government was the least government struck them as laughable and ignorant and all of that. So they loved the government intervention. Well, again, long story short, the Marxist tradition got caught up in what happened in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the initial phase of the revolution, and here I'm quoting Lenin, was for the advanced part of the working class, organized in the Soviet Communist Party, had taken over the state. And Lenin himself referred to this as state capitalism, which he was happy they had achieved because now they could go on to the big issue, which is a transition beyond any kind of capitalism to socialism. Unfortunately, he had an aneurysm and died a very few years after the Russian Revolution, which was then taken over by Stalin. And Stalin simply declared, we've achieved socialism because look what we're doing. The state has displaced the private. Well, if that's what your idea is of socialism, when you encounter Keynesians, they sound like they're halfway to your position. They too think that the state is the solution. So they begin to be working together to criticize free market or neoclassical or whatever you want to call it, that kind of older, laissez faire inheritance. And they work together, but often having all kinds of troubles because one of them wants to save capitalism, the other one doesn't. These are radically different ways of thinking about the world and push very smart people in different kinds of directions. But now your point. One of the proofs, if you like, that Keynesianism was there to save capitalism was that as soon as the Great Depression was over, as soon as the war which ended the Great Depression was over, World War II, and Franklin Roosevelt, the politician who took the Keynesian revolution and installed it, even more than happened in his homeland, Roosevelt died at the end of World War II. The capitalist class revolted. There's no other way to describe this. They had been horrified because during the regime of Roosevelt and those who followed him around the world, they proceeded, the logic of Keynes's argument, to tax corporations and the rich in order to spread that money across the mass of society. Here in the United States, they created the Social Security system. We never had a national pension system. This gave every American age 65 and older a check every month for the rest of their lives, and a pretty generous one. They passed the first minimum wage. We never had that before. They passed the first unemployment compensation. If you lose your job, and this is at a time when there are tens of millions of people without a job, Great Depression, we will give you money for a year every week to get you okay. And then the biggest one, we're going to hire 10 or 15 million unemployed people and put them to work, give them a job and an income. These were staggering interventions by the government, changed everything, violated every premise of free market economics, but had to be done and was done by acclamation. For those of you not familiar with American history, Roosevelt was reelected president 3 times in a row. No president in the history of the country had ever had that happen. He is the most radical we ever had and the most popular we ever had in this country. You ought to think about that if you're not familiar with it. The president who attacked the corporations where they live, taking their money with taxes and basically forced borrowing, became the most popular president the country ever had. When he died, the Republicans pushed through a law that no subsequent president could hold office more than 2 times. Mr. Trump will have to get going in 3.5 years unless he can change the law, which will not be easy. But then again, who knows what he's willing to do, especially since he knows it's over if he doesn't do it. Okay, now, last thing. When finally Marxists turned to this question of crisis, they did something very logical given where they had come from. The neoclassical tradition, and indeed intellectual life in the United States, left, right, and center, had always been what an epistemologist would call essentialist. They posed questions in economics. What is the key cause of something? The rise of an interest rate, balance of payments deficit, an economic crisis. What is the key cause? And there is an endless literature in economics sitting in every university library as we speak that offers the conclusions reached by many economists, including many who won Nobel Prizes and all of that, purporting to tell us what the key cause of the crisis is. Nowadays, because of the disrepute of the sunspot theory, it would be something in economics. Okay. So the key cause is an imbalance between supply and demand. Then there's an endless discussion. Is it more the demand or is it more the supply? This is awful. From my perspective, you are standing 6 foot deep in the mud at the bottom of a river, and the important thing is to get out of the mud. Don't lectures about the water or the mud. Get out of the mud. That's your urgent problem.
We're running out of time, Professor. I just wanted to ask you one last question because this is pertinent. Um, you, like Lenin, have been arguing, because for those of you who are interested, Lenin wrote an article called On Cooperation, literally about 7 or 8 months before he died, where he said, and I'm quoting directly, he said that the only task that remains now is to organize the society in cooperatives. So I wanted to conclude with this particular policy alternative, if you like. I'm using the bourgeois language, notice. That because one of the things that we started off with in this episode is the idea of technological progress. Now, even without studying economics, it was fairly obvious to me that, in theory at least, technological progress should be a good thing, right? It would make my job easier. I would have to work for fewer hours, etc., etc. So, am I correct in thinking that a system of cooperatives, a system that is not premised on surplus value extraction by non producing members of society, am I correct in assuming that, in addition to the benefits of eliminating class exploitation, etc., such a system of cooperation and cooperatives would also mitigate the potentialities of crises in capitalism? For example, I mean, instead of firing workers, as capitalists do when technology improves, am I just making this up, or am I right in thinking that a system of cooperators would kind of think about this issue and handle it differently? How would you think about that? Help us think about that particular aspect.
Well, I think the short answer is that an economy based on worker cooperatives, that meaning of the word collectivization, that the gap between employer and employee is finally overcome in the very Hegelian sense of collapsing the two into one another. So you've overcome it, you've eradicated it, and yet you've preserved it at the same time because you make the employer and the employee the same person. Okay, so let me give you two examples, one in technology and then one in this question of how it would shape society. Technology has always sold itself by the people who love it as a way to give you more leisure, to give you more free time, to give you a better standard of living with less effort. It's really always been the argument. And it has led countless comedians to make us laugh by saying we had all these development. We're working harder now than we ever did. I'm working more hours. I have more job. Where is all the promised loveliness? The people at the top, the rich, they seem to have some of it, but I don't. I mean, the mass of people have none of it. And the best way I know how to explain this is to give a simple example. And if you're interested in arithmetic, keep track. You'll see the arithmetic works out. Okay, here we go. AI or any other technological breakthrough. The capitalist installs it. Why? Let's assume that the technological breakthrough makes all workers doubly productive. So instead of making one widget per hour in your work, you make two. What does the capitalist do? Simple example. Let's assume that the capitalist wants to sell the same quantity of output into the market. That way he can charge the same as he always has, sell what he has produced, and take the revenue. He will enjoy a much increased profit because he fired half the labor force, because the remaining half, now being doubly productive, can produce the same output, which he can sell for the same revenue. So he gets the same revenue, but his profit shoots up because the half of the wage bill he used to give to his workers, he keeps for himself. He's made a fantastic profit increase by bringing that new technology in. It's wonderful for him. And to the half of the workers he's fired, he says with a genuine smile, "Have a nice day." Now let's look at what a worker co op would do. Look at the same thing, and they would say, "This is a great invention. We will immediately bring it into our workplace and we will install it. And everybody's workday will be cut in half. Nobody will be fired. Nobody's wages will be cut. But the entire workforce will enjoy 4 more hours a day of free time. They will only have to work from 12 to 4 or from 8 to 12, but not an 8-hour day." It all works out. This enterprise would have the same output as before, the same revenue as before, the same profit as before. It all works out. What they would have done is install the technology to enhance the leisure of the majority of people in any workplace. It's therefore the obviously democratic way to install technology. So the problem has never been technology. It's always been capitalism, because the way the capitalist sees the technology, the way he then utilizes it, installs it, does enhance his profit, which is why he likes it. And it is also how the capitalist does it that makes the working class suspicious and bitter and hostile against technology, because the working class doesn't understand, unless we bring it to them, that it doesn't have to be that way. The system doesn't, and the technology doesn't, and both of those are under our control if only we take it.
The problem has never been technology. The problem was and is capitalism.
Yes.
All right, guys, we've run out of time. I hope you got something out of it. Remember to subscribe and please comment, as well as contributing. If you love and like the work that we're doing, please contribute at this particular link to our cause. All right, guys, I hope you got something out of it. I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.